Okay, well, this is some work that Rachel and I have been kind of dabbling with on and off again for the past 6 or 7 years. This idea of trying to come up with a kind of a language or a way of understanding psychological phenomena from the very micro to the very macro scale. So my background is in complex systems. I was trained as an ecological psychology at University of Connecticut, and very much adopted a kind of more physical, formal, mathematical approach to understanding human behavior. And Rachel, is a social psychologist, deals with much more meaningful things than I've historically dealt with, a very different level. And so part of this work is trying to kind of bridge that gap between a more kind of lawful, formal description of phenomena or explanation through to something that can kind of transcend the scales of phenomena that we see across psychology. And for us, the concepts of symmetry, which were first taught to us by Robert Shaw and Michael Turvey at the University of Connecticut, have kind of been sitting at the back of our minds, but it's only been, as I said, in the last kind of 6 or 7 years that we've truly kind of understood the power of what both the principles of symmetry and symmetry breaking can potentially hold for us understanding psychological phenomena. And I think it fits very well with the theme of this symposium. We're trying to kind of cross those qualitative, quantitative boundaries, and we're kind of starting to feel that symmetry and the principles of symmetry might provide us a way of doing this. So a good place to start is with a classic Richard Feynman example. So here, we've all experienced this. We go to a wedding. There's these beautiful tables that are set out with perfect symmetry. And unless we've been trained in social etiquette, which I never was, we sit down at the table and we have no idea which cutlery we should use, which glass we should pick up, because everything is both the right and the left at the same time. But of course, Uncle Joe comes along, has had a little bit too much to drink, and just grabs the first glass that he comes to, and all of a sudden, with that break in symmetry, the definition of what glass everyone else should choose is just defined. And so there's this idea that you have symmetry, and then through the process of symmetry breaking, you get this collective organization. So prior to Uncle Joe reaching for that glass, everyone was kind of stuck in this left-right decision. Okay, this kind of symmetric state. But then through the breaking of that symmetry, not only is the coordination defined for everybody that's at that table, it's always also defined in the future. Anyone who comes to that table later on will automatically know which glass is theirs. And so it's a beautiful example of how you can start to use ideas of symmetry and symmetry understanding to understand the coordination that you get between people. So symmetry as a concept is something that we're all familiar with. And so when we hear the word symmetry, we often think of things like these pictures on the screen. So, patterns that share some kind of a symmetrical arrangement. We can go a little bit further and to think about this in terms of geometric objects, which is another kind of classic way we understand the principles of symmetry. And here we're starting to move to a slightly more formal definition of symmetry, where symmetry corresponds to a set of transformations that leave something the same. Okay, so kind of invariant. So we think about a circle, then there's an infinite or continuous number of rotations that we can make that will leave the circle looking exactly the same. If we think about an equilateral triangle, then there's 6 transformations, 3 rotations, and 3 reflections that we can act on that object to leave it kind of looking the same. Symmetry has, of course, a wide implications. It's used across the sciences. It's fundamental to how we understand physics, from both quantum phenomena through to kind of more classic Newtonian physics. Noether's theorem, which translates invariances to laws of conversation, is a well-known one. But it's interesting that Vasu brought up the idea of the scientific method, because sometimes we don't realize that the scientific method itself is always defined about symmetry. So the fact that we think of a good experiment where I can conduct the experiment on Monday and get a certain result, and then if I have a phenomena, then I should be able to conduct that experiment on Friday and find exactly the same result. So there we've got a transformation in time, but the idea of finding a robust result is that we get that same result over that transformation. And we can also think about that in terms of space. So if I conduct an experiment at Macquarie University, then if I have a phenomena that's independent of spatial location, then if I go and run that experiment at Warsaw, I should find the same result. If I don't find the same result, then that's also interesting, but it tells me that there's something asymmetric about those spatial locations that results in a different outcome. So again, we're starting to see this relationship between symmetry and inherent understanding that symmetry breaking is key to the creation of phenomena. So here's a quick physical example that I hopefully won't spend too much time on. But this is an experiment that you can run at home. You get some nickel filings and you put them in a petri dish of water, and then you create a magnetic field. And I'm skipping over some details. But when you do that, these iron filings clump together and form these little, what we call magnetic snakes. And these magnetic snakes, they're not alive, but they, like lots of complex systems, exhibit somewhat intentional behavior, and the fact that you get a symmetry break in terms of how the magnetic field is flowing through these nickel filings, which make these snakes move through the liquid. And they almost seem like they're alive. Obviously, they're not alive, but it's this classic example about how you can take the right kinds of physical arrangements and create animate objects. So the one that we're seeing right now is an idea of spontaneous symmetry breaking. We get random fluctuations in the arrangement of these nickel filings that lead to these kinds of propulsion of these kind of snake arrangements. What's even more interesting is that we can also induce a symmetry break by placing a glass bead within the arrangement. What this does is this creates a kind of head-body arrangement, which leads to an organism that spends its time traveling around picking up the rest of these iron filings. So here, by inducing a symmetry break, we've created an even greater level of organization. And this organization, again, has this kind of directed intentionality to it. Again, it's not intentional, but it kind of displays properties where we can start to imagine how these kinds of symmetry breaking phenomena can lead to the realization of intentional behavior. Symmetry breaking, again, is used throughout science. So Stewart and Golubtsky have demonstrated how one can use symmetry breaking or cascades of symmetry breaking phenomena to understand the dynamics of morphogenesis, where the development of organisms is defined by these symmetry breaking dynamics, where evolution is not the selection of symmetric forms, but rather symmetry defines those possibilities that can exist, and nature kind of makes the most of them. When you understand the nervous system, you can think about it in the same way. Some great work by Jersa and colleagues has demonstrated how these kind of symmetry breaking phenomena lead to kind of the modulation of mind and potentially the nervous system. Where if you have a nervous structure that's completely coupled, then it's actually non-functional. And so through development, you find this cascading of symmetry breaking that leads to modular structures. And it's those modular structures that lead to functional coding behavior. Again, I'm moving kind of fast, and I'm going to skip over this figure relatively quickly. Again, this is kind of a teaser talk, so that hopefully next year I can spend more time going into a lot of the details. But you can start to understand any system from these notions of symmetry, where on one hand you have systems that are completely uncoupled, where there's high uncertainty. If you want to use the word entropy, you can there as well. And on the other side, we have highly coupled systems that are highly certain, so highly constrained and highly unconstrained. And what's interesting is that complex dynamical systems, psychological systems, tend to live in that middle area between not overly coupled and not overly constrained. And if you take the kind of normalized product of these kind of coupling and uncertainty functions, what you get is order, where increases in organization or maximizing kind of structural order corresponds to that midpoint between coupling and uncertainty. And what I find is even more interesting is you take the inverse of order or organization, you get symmetry. And I think this is another thing that sometimes is not always understood, that reductions in symmetry or redistributions in symmetry is what we might want to say, actually corresponds to increase in organization. So greater symmetry is not greater order. In fact, it's the opposite way around. This is kind of easy to understand when we start to think about perception. So if we look at the top three images, imagine that we had that sphere that was rotating in three-dimensional space. So in the top three images, it's perfectly symmetric. So there's no way of telling that it's rotating because spheres have continuous symmetries with regards to rotation. However, in the bottom three images, if I just splash some paint on it in some random areas and create a break in the symmetry, all of a sudden we'll perceive that sphere as rotating. Again, this idea that in order to perceive something, in order for something to have some kind of phenomenological order, it requires some kind of symmetry break. And Pierre Curie was famously noted as saying it's dissymmetry, not symmetry, that creates the phenomena. So as a scientist, one kind of tries to understand what are the symmetry breaking events or phenomena that might lead to the creation of some kind of phenomenological order. Symmetry breaking also rests behind the perception-action cycle. So we can start to think of action as a transformation. Again, symmetry is the result of something that's invariant over a transformation. When you move or act, you're generating some kind of transformation. And then perception is the process of detecting what is the same and what changes as a function of that action. So whatever is invariant or whatever is invariant provides information that's defined by that action. And this in turn is the perception-action cycle. So far I've kind of defined symmetry at a rather explanatory level, kind of a descriptive level. But what's even more powerful about symmetry is there's actually a formal mathematics of symmetry that we can use to then quantify the symmetries of phenomena. So here I don't have enough time to get into the formal aspects of symmetry, other than say that it's a form of abstract algebra known as group theory. And here on the slides here, I've just got a simple demonstration of how you can quantify the symmetry transformations or the symmetry group for an equilateral triangle. And by defining a symmetry group for a particular object or phenomena, you can define other kind of subgroups of potential organizations that can exist given symmetry breaking. And you can also look at phenomena that are completely different yet share the same symmetry group and start to understand their relation. This kind of idea of a symmetry group has been used by Golitsky and Stewart to understand how you can predict the kinds of coordination patterns that will exist between coupled oscillators. And they've used this theory of symmetric Hopf bifurcations in order to predict the gait patterns that you see for two-legged, four-legged, six-legged animals. And you can make very precise predictions about the patterns that should exist and the central pattern generators or the nervous system architecture that can be used to do this. There's a great study by Yokoyama and Yamamoto which demonstrated how the same theory of symmetry groups can understand the patterns of behavior that you see when you've got three attacking players passing a ball and you have a fourth player trying to take that ball away from them. And in fact, the patterns of rotation that you see between these soccer players is predicted by group theory in relation to the symmetries that define the coordination patterns. Schaefer and Stern have also demonstrated how group theory and symmetry transformations can explain the dance patterns that people produce in all forms of modern dance. And in fact, they even use dance to teach abstract algebra to children by showing how transformations from one symmetry group to another can define the transitions between different orders of behavioral organization at the level of dance. Again, I'm moving fast, but I want to give an overview of the different levels that you can use these kinds of concepts. Music is another one, whether it's transformations in the patterns of tonal textures in scores. And in fact, David Lewin has also demonstrated how you can use group theory to understand the movements in things like Beethoven's symphonies, and how musical behavior is a path through these kinds of defined symmetry groups, where you can translate different patterns to other different patterns, different octaves to different octaves. At a more simple level, we can even understand the creation of sound or tones as a symmetry breaking phenomena. So if we take two sine waves, one of a high frequency, one of a low frequency, and we combine those, we'll get a more complex tonal structure that has a richer order to it that we feel in musical expression. In terms of extending this idea a little bit further, improvisation in music or in conversation or any context is the process of breaking symmetries to create new symmetries. Herman Weil famously wrote, "Beauty is bound up in symmetry." I've added broken in there. But there's some great work demonstrating how kind of new musical orders are reached through a kind of reconstruction of a symmetric musical idea, where when you're improvising, you're introducing these kinds of asymmetries that lead to more asymmetries, and over a period of time create kind of a temporal symmetry or a new order that leads to a new piece of music. Symmetry also plays a fundamental role in sport. So if you've ever played any kind of team sport, so here I've got rugby on one side, as the defending player, you're trying to create symmetry, this kind of man-on-man defense, where that kind of symmetry in terms of the man-on-man defense prevents the attacking team from breaking through. Of course, if you're the attacking team, your aim is to break that symmetry, to create a space or an affordance for you to take advantage of in order to score that try. Sarah Kim later on is going to talk about martial arts, and again, in these kinds of fighting contexts, breaking symmetry is what gives you the advantage over your opponent. So you're always trying to kind of create those asymmetries in order to create the opportunity for behavior. I'll end by just saying that this also applies at the level of higher order social groups. So Roberts and Goldstein have a great study demonstrating how when you have large groups performing cognitive phenomena, that sometimes you'll get the emergence of roles, and those emergence of roles play a functional role in creating higher order states of social organization where there's a positive outcome. Of course, symmetry breaking can also have a very negative consequence. So racial diversity is often something that's leads to symmetry breaks that have kind of detrimental effects to minority groups. And Schilling's famous model of segregation provides a great example of this, where even the tiniest asymmetries in racial preference can lead to very segregated societies. So the smallest symmetry break creates this kind of organization that can also have these very negative effects. So this is our UTE, our unified theory of everything. Everyone's got to have one to move them forward. And so for us, it's trying to understand how we can use the principles of symmetry, both informally and formally, to start to tackle these qualitative, quantitative ideas. And by identifying the explicit, spontaneous, and induced process of symmetry breaking within the boundary conditions of natural law, that we can start to understand the emergence of behavior at all scales, from low-level action through to high-level social phenomena. No man is an island, and Rachel and I worked a lot on this, but we also have a number of other colleagues that I'd like to just represent here at the last slide. So thanks.
Thank you very much.